Today we're going to be talking about tree and shrub planting techniques. Picking the right tree, going through selecting that to in the ground to establishing it and what to do afterwards. So with that, so planting, there's a lot of things to consider. It's not as easy as or as simple as kind of just grabbing a tree and throwing it in the ground. You got to have the right tree for the right place. You have to, understand your plant selection, planting, establishment, pruning, plant health management, kind of have all that into consideration at the at once to make sure you have the most success possible. I mean, the benefits of a well planned out and maintained landscape are far beyond the visual. You're building an ecosystem, a self-sustaining environment in a way, and everything you plant plays a role in that, and how healthy it is after planting and how well it's established. You can plan the most beautiful landscape in the world, but if you don't get good establishment or a healthy tree from the beginning, you'll have pest issues just because it'll be a weaker tree. So trees being planted improperly or poor stock is the number one reason trees are removed in the landscape that I've seen by far. You've got girdling roots that can become an issue from, not doing good root pruning at planting, or just, being girdled by planting materials. So there's a lot of things to kind of watch out for to make sure you've got a good, healthy tree to have good success in the future. So thinking about that right tree in the right place, it doesn't matter what kind of tree it is. Every tree has its place. Like this is a ginkgo, and you can see on that picture on the right, a beautiful fall color on this tree. They're an amazing tree. The only tree left of their genus and species, very little disease. One of the oldest tree species around, actually, thought to be extinct for a little while. But you can see on the left here, the female ginkgo produces a berry that is very bad smelling. So they don't tend to sell the female ginkgo, but when they do, they can end up over the street. And that's when you've got this fruit all over the place. And then that tree will become a nuisance. So kind of planning on how big that tree is going to be, what's going to be under that tree in the future, and what's around it plays a huge role in, that whole part of the right tree, right place scenario. We've got a lot of things to consider in that right tree, right place. We've got light, water, growing space, and soil. So if you've got, when considering trees, there's phototropic trees and there's geotropic trees. So phototropic is a tree's want to grow towards the sun, where geotropic is a tree's want to grow up. And there's going to be different responses. If you plant a tree on the edge of your lawn on a wood line that has phototropic tendencies, it's going to lean out over your yard, where a geotropic tree planted on the wood line is going to tend to grow straighter. A lot of times conifers are a good choice for growing straight up. Hemlock and spruce, they don't tend to lean towards the light as far as the main trunk goes. The branches are opportunistic for sun and energy. Whereas, if you plant an oak on the edge of a lawn, it's going to grow over your house, over the grass, and things of that nature. As far as water goes, you got to pick a tree that's going to, survive in whatever the environment may be. If you have heavy clay soils that don't drain well, you need a plant that can survive in a wet situation. And a good way to test for that is, the percolation rate. So you dig a 24-inch deep cylindrical hole, maybe about 4-inch diameter, 2 feet deep. Fill that hole with water. After it drains all the way, fill it a second time. If it doesn't drain within 24 hours that second time, you have a very low percolation rate, and you have to choose a plant that can live in a very wet environment. Something like a London plane is very good at water, tolerating a lot of water. And, you got to consider the growing space for the plant. Some trees, require a lot of space, where ornamentals, they don't. So a Japanese maple versus a sugar maple, have very different needs for the area they're in. And if you select the wrong type of tree for the space, if you pick a large tree and give it a small space, you have to prune it very often. Pruning trees at any point, anytime you prune a tree, that's a wound. You're removing, the leaves, which are their energy making machines. So you don't want to have to prune a tree. You want to prune trees as little as possible. And that's why picking the right tree for the space is important. And then your soil, nutrient availability, especially in urban areas, we have poor nutrient availability. So some trees are just a little more bulletproof than others. A good way to, select a tree that can grow in urban soils is just, take a walk in the city and see what kind of trees that do well on the sidewalk. Again, you've got, honey locust does well on sidewalks. London plane does well on sidewalks. Zelkova does well. But if you live more in the country with good soils that haven't been scraped down for construction or compacted, you have a lot more options. So again, in selecting that tree, we have to have expectations. Why are we planting that tree? And it's always good to have a conversation with your customer, around that, because sometimes they may say that they want, one tree over another. Even when it comes down to fall color, say they may want a sugar maple because it has beautiful fall color. But once you had that conversation and realized it was the fall color why they wanted the sugar maple, if it's a wet area, you might want to recommend the Tupelo, which grows much better in wet environments, but again, beautiful bright red fall foliage. So by picking those expectations, finding out what the customer was looking for, not just the plant they wanted, we can tailor a plant better to their needs. Spring flowers, fruit, shade, screening. Some people even make, crab apple wine. So even though somebody wants a crab apple, which is a fruit tree, knowing why they want that fruit tree even may change the type of crab apple you pick, because, you may have more disease resistant varieties that are easier than others, whether you wanted it for the flowers or the fruit. Shade trees. Again, here's the little comment on the right. The one who plants trees knowing that he or she will never sit in their shade has at least started to understand the meaning of life. So shade is, you have to think about, is that a long-term goal, or is it something where, if they have a ton of sun on their house and they're looking for, energy reduction because they don't want their sun baking in the summer. If the shade needs to be more immediate, you might pick something faster growing like a tulip poplar, yellow poplar or something like that, where, if they want shade for the long term, you might go with something like a white oak that grows a lot slower. So, again, understanding why you're planting a tree or why your customer wants a tree better helps you tailor that plant to the scenario, to the situation, to ensure it stays there longer. If you pick the wrong tree for the wrong place, again, that's where a customer could get tired of plant healthcare problems, tired of pruning, and end up just giving up on the tree and cutting it down. So the more of these scenarios we can consider before putting a tree in the ground, the better chance we have of that tree making it for the long term. Another thing we have to consider now more than ever, planting trees, is because we want trees to live 50 to 100 years. So we have to consider climate change. We're not looking for trees to grow for 10 years or 15 years, even hundreds of years is obviously better. So the way we can do that is, obviously with climate change, you have days that are hotter than normal, colder than normal. We have dry periods, we have wet periods. But basically what it is we have extremes now. And that's what we have to get used to. So we have our growing zones, our averages of what happens, the average low temperature we hit in a year. And that's starting to change. We're considered now, you could go from 6A to a 6B as those average winter temperatures start to come up, because it's your average winter low that decides your growing zone. But because we have those extremes, like we saw in Texas recently, we shouldn't start planting 6B plants that can't tolerate that 6A, 5B, because we still will get those events every 5 to 10 years that are colder than normal. So we have to kind of take in mind, even though the zones are changing, when we're talking about something that's going to live 50 to 100 years, it's going to see these extremes of climate change. We may see average rainfall for a year, but it might be from, one thunderstorm in July that gave us 3 inches of rain. And that was, the average for the month. And then it's dry for 4 weeks, and that's a drought, even though we had the average amount of rain. So picking trees that are a little hardier to drought tolerance, a little hardier to hot weather, but keeping those colds in mind. So I wouldn't quite jump the zones yet and start not considering this a 6A area or a 5B area, wherever you may be from. Remember, we will still get those cold extremes. So now plant selection. Once you've decided what kind of tree you want to plant, now we're going to go to the nursery and we're going to get our tree, or the nursery is going to bring them to us. But we have to remember, nurseries have a different goal in mind than we do. They have aesthetic in mind over, that main central leader. They're going to go for a full plant that sells well. And that's because they're relying on us as arborists to know how to prune that tree for a central leader when necessary, or to treat it as an ornamental when necessary. So they really have that in mind, that they're going to sell a good looking plant, but we're going to take over what needs to be done from there. You can see this tree on the right out of the gate, you can see two strong central leaders. If you wanted that to be a shade tree, it's a poor choice. You'd have to subordinate one of those leads down and do a lot of, pruning on that. So you might want to select something that has a little more obvious of a central leader, even if it's too thick and has competition. The aspect ratio of that main stem to that first main branch on the right is 1-to-1. You don't really want branches that are above half the size of the main trunk, or you've got a long fight to go when you plant young trees. So patience is the best case scenario for selecting trees and planting trees. Anytime you can plant a smaller tree, it's going to be healthier in the long run. It's less root damage to transplant small plants. The planting depth is much easier to get right. If you plant trees that are 1 or 2 feet tall versus the 2.5-inch diameter, 10-foot tall trees, it's very hard to plant those 6 inches too deep. You're not going to end up with those girdling root issues planting smaller trees as you do with large trees. And if you have that patience of 5 or 10 years, a 2-foot tall tree would, in most scenarios of the same species, will outpace a 3-inch diameter or larger planted tree, after that 10-year period, and be much better established with far less health concerns. And it's a lot less input on your end planting small in watering the tree consistently, amending the soils. They're very adaptive when they're young to the site conditions. Sometimes you do have to plant larger trees, especially in urban environments. If you're doing a street planting, I've heard of scenarios where, you have vandalism and even theft of plants. So planting larger trees that are too big to just pick up and put in your car actually is necessary in some situations. So, the pros of larger trees: they look better at the time of planting. It's instant gratification. They're a little safer from machinery impact, getting run over by a lawnmower, things like that. But those smaller trees, just the benefits of them are amazing, just in how fast they'll take off and how much less labor and input it takes to establish them. So another thing we have to consider, at the nursery is we got to do a root inspection on that tree. We want to know how deep those roots are in the root ball from planting, basically. And this happens because even at the nursery, when they transplant trees from place to place, to give them more room, they plant them very densely when they're small. Once they're 1 inch in diameter, they might transplant them to a bigger growing field. When they do this, sometimes they plant them a little bit deeper each time. And it makes sense in a nursery environment because that means they're not going to have to stake these things every time they move them. The tree is going to be planted deeper with a heavy root ball and not blow over. And again, this is a model for their success, and them knowing that we then have to correct that as the arborist at planting, because it's not going to do long-term damage at a couple inches too deep. It's when we plant it permanently too deep. So we want to get a root probe and just probe around the base of that tree. And the roots should be within 2 inches of the surface of the root ball. If they're more than 4 inches from the surface of the root ball on a balled and burlap tree, you don't buy that tree. That means the last time it was dug, a lot of the base of that root system was taken off. So you want the roots within the top 3-4 inches of that root ball. 2 is best. And you're looking to find a minimum of about 3 main roots 1 inch out from the trunk. So even if you just take like a barbecue skewer for a kebab or something, just go about 1 inch out from the trunk and probe around, and you should find 3 main roots. If you only have, 2 big roots, that tree is going to be, more prone to wind throw in the future. Establishment will be more difficult. So, you want a good root system, evenly distributed, go in different directions, and more towards the surface to make sure not too much has been taken off. Girdling roots, this is a problem you have with containerized stock. So in container stock, you can, feel around the container, loosen it up a little bit. You can take that plant out a little bit and take a look and see how girdled the roots are. Minimal girdling is expected on a potted plant. You're going to have to do root pruning or, root teasing to straighten those out if you do containerize plants. The benefits of it are there's less root damage from digging the tree to planting the tree, but then you have to know how to untangle those roots and prune them if you want to do containerized plantings. Another thing you should look for is the appearance of the roots. They should be healthy white or tan in color. If those roots are black or have an off smell in any way, that can indicate that they've been waterlogged at some point. There's rotting organic material. That root system is struggling. So, you want to use all your senses. You want to feel around, make sure the roots are going in a good direction. Take a look at them, make sure they're white or tan in color, and make sure there's no off smells. These are all things to look for when you're inspecting the root ball of a plant, because ultimately, that's one of the most important parts in picking a good specimen, is making sure you've got it off to a good start with good, healthy roots. So then we move on after that, and that's when we'll inspect the crown. Maybe you inspect the crown before you look at the roots because it's a little easier. But what we're looking for is a good live crown ratio. And what that live crown ratio is out of the total tree height or plant height from the root flare to the top, what percentage of that has foliage, basically? How much of that has branches that are photosynthesizing? And when you're talking about deciduous trees, oaks, maples, you want at least a 60% live crown ratio. So if you've got a 10-foot tall tree, you want a good 6 feet of foliage on that tree. On conifers, you want to have at least a 70% live crown ratio. So on a 10-foot, if you planted a 10-foot tall spruce, you would want 7 feet of needles. And that's important in establishing proper trunk taper on the plant. If you don't have, even branching, feeding nutrients into this tree from photosynthesis, you're going to have a tall, thin, sticky tree that is prone to even more wind throw. Lower branches on trees and keeping that, even with large trees, that crown ratio is very important. The lower branches are also like shock absorbers in the wind and slow down sway. So that really helps the root system establish also, because it's not moving around so much. Again, we're looking for that central leader when we need it. Scaffolding branches, these are going to be all of our limbs around the tree. We don't want them all on one side or all of them too close together in tight rings. We want them evenly dispersed. And again, we're looking at that aspect ratio. We don't want any limbs that are more than half the size of the trunk at the point of attachment. So, that's always, those things are harder to correct with our structural pruning. And insects, obviously, we're looking for any borers in the trunk or any, egg masses, signs of fungal issues. These can show signs that tree is already stressed out and insects are attracted to it. Healthy trees can defend themselves against a lot of problems. So if you see a problem on a tree at the nursery, it's probably a weak tree. The one right next to it may not have them because it's a little healthier. And in this selection process, don't be afraid to reject trees at the nursery, and say, this one's not for me. Even when you have plants delivered to your shop, which is, very common, we put in orders and these plants come in, we don't want to bother people. So we may not say if a tree is the best or not. But again, don't be afraid to take that tree and say, put this back on your truck, bring it back to the shop and get me another one. Because sometimes the people that load the order or deliver the order, or even your employees that unload it, they may not have a stake in the game. So they may not be doing these inspections from one side to the other. So make sure you're checking those things out. And when you're working consistently with the same nurseries, they'll remember your name after you send a few plants back, and they'll start to do the inspections themselves, just to ensure their driver's not going back and forth, wasting labor, wasting time, wasting fuel. So don't be afraid to reject them, because then you'll get the reputation of knowing what you're getting, what you're talking about, and you'll get better plant stock in the end. Because when you're looking in the catalog, the price is the price based on diameter or height or size of the pot, 5 gallon, 10 gallon. The price is not based on the quality. So a lot of times, again, just ensure that you're doing those inspections. Don't be afraid to be a stickler for these things, because in the end, it's your customer that pays, or if you're planting the tree for yourself, it's you that pays. So it's your reputation on the line once you accept that tree from the nursery. And that's why these inspections are so important. So step 3, we decided what tree we want. We've got the right tree for the right place. We've considered our growing conditions. We went to the nursery, we picked out the perfect plant. Now it's time to put this bad boy in the ground. So obviously step 1, roots down, branches up. It sounds easy. But the best thing about planting is it brings a community together. We see Arbor Day events all over the country. It makes us feel good to plant trees, so we got to remember that also. It's not just business. People love it. We love it. It always brings good PR, putting trees in the ground. It's good times. And, think about it. We kind of evolved along with trees in our life. They make us feel, more at home. We evolved in the forest. We eat from them. They shelter us. They build our homes. We use them as memorial trees when people pass, to dedicate situations, even like this building was planted here, and at the same time we put in this tree, and it has feeling. So, remember, trees do have that importance. And again, this is when we want trees to be 300-400 years old. And the only way we're going to have these, good time memorial trees last a long time is through proper selection and planting. So first we have to remember how to handle trees properly. And when handling trees, we have to consider a lot of things. We have to cover them when transporting with a tarp or some kind of wind protection. And I've heard a lot of people that are, say, well, if it blows 40-50 miles an hour, trees don't die. So if I'm only driving 35-40 down the highway, why is it such a big deal to put a tarp on it? I've heard that argument because it takes time to put a tarp on, and people like to save time. But it's because these trees have limited root systems, because they've just been dug out of the ground. So the faster that wind goes over them, they're going to desiccate. It's going to start to pull the moisture out of that tree even faster, and they won't be able to replace it. So you'll put them into drought stress, root decline, and the leaves will shed from that stress. So that's why it's important to cover them and transport, even when you go in speeds that wouldn't affect a tree that's in the ground. You have to remember that this tree's different. It's not, they react differently when they're dug and balled or containerized. When we have balled and burlap trees, we can never pick them up by their trunk. Same thing with containerized. Only bare root trees should be trunk lifted. For balled and burlapped, we're using ball dollies. We're using forks on machines, things of that nature. You can even put them on a tarp and drag them around, but don't pick up balled and burlapped or containerized trees by the trunk, if at all possible. And leave all those ties in place on the crown as long as you can. If you have to untie it to inspect it because you think you see a crack or something like that, maybe retie it before you move it after you inspect it. But you want those branch ties in place until it's right there at the planting site, even in the planting hole. As long as possible, keep those things safe, because you're working right around the base of that tree. You don't want to injure those lower branches. So when we get to digging the site for the planting hole, proper depth is the key thing to keep in mind. So again, we have to use the soil probe to find out where that root flare actually is. Because again, these trees are commonly, when balled and burlap, 2 or 3 inches too deep to begin with. So find the depth, find the base of your root ball, measure that, and don't dig any deeper than necessary. And you want that root flare even to be, 1 to 3 inches above grade. If you have a faster draining soil, 1 inch above grade is fine. If you're in a clay soil that doesn't drain well, you want to be closer to that 3 inches above grade. But again, if you dig that site too deep and then backfill it, what tends to happen is then that settles, and in the end, the tree ends up being too deep because it settles down into the ground. And then you've got a tree planted too deep that's prone to girdling roots and things like that. So with balled and burlap trees, containerized trees, we want to dig a hole about 2 to 3 times the width of that planting hole. Of that root ball. And we can just kind of taper that down to the bottom. It doesn't need to be the same depth as the root ball, 3 times as wide. Just 3 times as wide with a nice, kind of taper down to the root zone. And that's going to give the tree a lot more success in the long term as far as establishment goes, and being able to work into that soil profile a little better. So next we've got, placing the tree in the hole. Measure twice, plant once. Worst part about putting a tree in the planting hole is realizing that the hole's too deep, and you got to take it back out, because the more you handle that root ball, the more damage you're going to do to it. And then, that leads to having to stake the tree longer, use more aggressive supports in the long run. So you want to move that tree as little as you can. And again, plant it 1 inch high for, well-draining soils or average soils, and 2 to 3 inches high for clay soils. And you can just use your digging spade to kind of, line it up across the ground, make your measurement down, measure your root ball, and make sure you're getting all those things lined up. When possible, you want to get a minimum of a third of the wire basket off and the top third of the burlap. I like to get all of it off when the root ball is stable enough. And a little trick for that is when you have your wire basket and your tree next to the hole, you can wire snip the bottom of the cage. And then when you pick that plant up and put it in the hole, it doesn't have the bottom of the cage anymore because it's tapered. It still holds the ball together. And then you just snip the sides and it comes right off. So taking the bottom of the basket off right before it goes in the hole is the best way to get all the material off when possible. But the burlap sacks, if it's not caged, just fold it down and razor blade that off and then backfill it. And that's the time you would root prune it also. When it comes out of that container and goes in the hole, that's when you're teasing out as many roots as you can. Pruning roots that tend to go back towards the surface or circle, or any roots that may be cracked or otherwise unhealthy. That really is your best time to kind of get in there, take a look at what you've got, and straighten things out. Or else it kind of ends up like this tree on the right here, where you can see the girdling roots are just heavy on that plant. It's going to be very stressful for that tree to undergo the root pruning that's necessary for that tree to make it to 100 years. Probably without anything done, that's only a 20-year planting. And again, that's the most common reason trees fail in the landscape is root pruning wasn't done, things were planted too deep, and they girdle. There is a little bit of a controversy, going on right now about the wire baskets. Some people say that it's not necessary to cut them or remove them. They say wire would rust and break down, and we've all seen how the wire hasn't before. But the kind of the controversy of it is you need oxygen for metal to rust and break down. So if you have compacted anaerobic soils, the tree can't grow, and that's probably why it died, but it's also the reason it preserved the metal and made it look like the basket did it. So just kind of something to keep your eye on, the research on that. For now, we're still with that 1/3 minimum. That is the best management practice, but there is some neat long-term studies going on now on whether it's the growing conditions that make us blame the basket or, whether in the end it actually is. So backfilling the hole after we've dug it, we want to use the original soil that we dug out of that site. That's very important. We don't want to dig that hole, remove all the original soil, put our tree in and backfill it completely with compost and all these fun nutritional things, because you can get a perched water table. So you want to make sure you're using that original soil, amended if necessary, as little as possible, to make sure we still have a good, even draining soil. Do not put gravel in the bottom of the pit to, let water try to percolate out. It's not very helpful. And we want to backfill in layers, 3 to 4 inches at a time, tamping that down to make sure we avoid any, large air pockets. We want to water it in at the time of planting, obviously, not only because that's what's healthy for the plant, but because that's going to help get those air pockets out. It's going to help fill that up. Let your soil settle so you can get that last, inch on there. And then we want to put a berm around the tree at the edge of our planting hole, not around the root ball, but at the edges of the site we dug. And we're going to put that berm around there a couple inches high. And what that's going to do is allow us to water the plant more evenly and more efficiently, because we can just kind of fill that moat with 2 inches of water and let it slowly percolate into the soil. So as far as establishment goes, here's kind of just a cutout of this is what happens when trees get dug. All those roots get cut. So this is why they need our help in establishment. We do a lot of stress to a tree when we dig them and move them around. Healthy trees are able to handle this. They have, obviously we've been planting trees for probably, as long as people have farmed hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years. So they are capable of handling it, with establishment in mind and digging properly. But mulching is probably one of the most important things to keeping that soil moisture consistent, keeping the temperatures more consistent throughout the day so it doesn't get really hot and dry out. But you have to mulch properly. Don't put it up against the trunk of the tree. You want it about 2 inches deep inside of that moated area, inside that area that's been dug. Sad tree, don't volcano mulch. It promotes girdling, rots the bark. It's just bad in every way. So happy tree, no bark up against the mulch. But we also want to, remember those benefits of as mulch as that organic matter. As that breaks down, it's going to help amend the soil. It's going to help feed the microbes. The benefits of mulch go far, far beyond just the moisture and temperature control. And if you're using weed mat, try to use something that might be a little more organic and shorter lasting. If you use plastic weed mats, it's going to block that nutrient exchange from the mulch breaking down to getting into the soil. Your soil won't decompact if it is compacted. It blocks water from getting in easily. And it inhibits your ability to monitor soil moisture to know when it's time to water that tree. So staking, you want to stake the tree as low as possible to keep that root ball supported. Trees need the effects of wind to grow properly. And that's why you see trees grow differently in the forest where they're not affected by the wind like they are in the middle of a front yard or by the water. If you take a tree gets blown around, shaken a bit, even if you just take the branches and bend it on a small tree, they'll actually stop cell elongation of those terminal ends on the branches and put more energy into growing the trunk thicker. So by allowing the effects of the wind to blow those trees around, we're going to get a much thicker trunk, thicker branch to size ratio, where if we stake them too high up and don't allow that tree to bend, it's not going to be, it's not going to feel the environment and grow to it. So you want that tree to sway. But reasons we stake, they're unstable. Again, trunks bend and they can lift the roots. We want that root ball to be able to establish, but we need that tree to bend. Helps stop theft and it helps avoid mechanical injury. So there are lots of benefits to staking. But again, we want it low and we only want it there for, as short of a period as possible, one growing season, go back, re-inspect and see if that tree rooted and get those stakes out of there because, it's going to grow as if it's supported like that. So you want them gone so it can properly put on that taper. So then we've got, pruning at the time of planting is different than what you do to establish a tree kind of after, or prune it after it's been established. But all pruning is wounding and removes that energy source. So we have to keep that in mind, especially when planting. We have to have a long-term goal in mind. When you plant it, you may see that this branch may be temporary. It probably isn't going to last forever, but for 1 year, you can leave it. You can allow those leaves to photosynthesize and give that energy to the tree. So at the time of planting, we want it to be minimal. And this is why we want to pick good trees from the nursery, do good inspections, because we want as big and healthy of a crown as possible. It's no longer really recommended or that old way of doing it where, we cut half the roots off, let's reduce the crown. By reducing the crown at planting, we're limiting that tree's ability to grow new roots because it can't, make those carbohydrates that it needs. It can't build the energy to build itself. So by removing some leaves, you might say, well, we're going to lower transpiration, so it's less likely to dehydrate. Keeping that water at the proper amount in the soil is extremely important. You can have all the foliage if you can keep the water and nutrients right. So don't reduce the crown, just go after broken, dead, and branches that might cross or not last that first year until that tree's established. And then we'll get into the structural pruning after that. After it's established about a year, this is when we're going to get out there and really work with that tree. On the left, you can see there, the picture of that is what our kind of average maple looks like from the nursery. And if you never prune that tree, that's why when you see trees in front yards, they go up to about 5 feet, and then they go off into 5 main leaders with included bark and separate in the future. Because like I said, at the nursery, they're pruned to look nice at planting, but we need to make a dominant stem on that tree. And through that picture on the right, you can see how that structural pruning after it was established got it down to subordinating the limbs that were getting a little too large to trunk ratio and getting a dominant stem. Again, we're going for broken, dead, and crossing limbs. Going for a desired structure. If it's an ornamental tree like a dogwood or a Japanese maple, multi-stem is fine. But if the left side is growing faster than the right, or it has more sun on one side than the other, we may subordinate to keep that tree balanced through pruning. But we're going to start to, establish long-term scaffolding branches and start slowly removing those temporary branches that were feeding the trunk, over time. So this is also a good business model. A lot of times trees get planted and maybe you feed the tree at the time of planting, you got your money and you leave. But you're not done. That tree needs structural pruning. It needs to be trained to be able to take care of itself. In the forest, trees naturally have that proper structure because, the sun is up, they grow one large straight stem to get to the sun as fast as possible. So they have a strong central leader. When we plant them in the middle of the front yard and when they've been pruned in a nursery to be fuller, we've taken away their natural growth structure to replace it with something else or change their environment. And that's why we have to do this structural pruning. Even if you didn't plant the tree, if you see a tree that's been planted for more than a year or two on one of your customers' properties and it's not structurally correct, you might as well bring that up and recommend to your customer that they have that tree taken care of, because obviously the company that planted it didn't bring it up. They don't plan on doing it or it'd be done. And it sets you apart as a more knowledgeable company, and you'll probably be the person that plants their next tree. So, bring that up even if you didn't put the tree in the ground. If you've just been watching it, do the structural pruning on that plant. And the schedule for that is, on ornamentals, you want to do that about once every year or two for the first 10 years that tree is alive. Making smaller cuts, smaller adjustments more often. After that tree's been in the ground about 10 years, on ornamentals, we can generally drop back to every 1 to 3 years on pruning. Shade trees, again, every year or two for 10 years, we want to be establishing that main stem and that structure. And then after 10 years, we can drop back to prune every 4 to 7. Because again, you're not wanting to prune anything more than what's necessary. You don't want to prune trees if you don't have to. So once they're established, going to that 4 to 7 years, we're going after crossing branches, dead branches, broken branches, things like that. Or if there's a major storm, go and inspect the trees that you've been taking care of for a long time. But with good establishment, trees can maintain themselves for quite some time. But again, this is why don't just plant and leave the money on the table, or expect it to be able to take care of itself, because it's not in its natural environment. We've done something different with it. So they do need care. And then there's plant health management. Prevention is key. Healthy plants planted well prevent the disease through soil management and proper selection and planting. Cultural sanitation, don't allow areas to build up that would harbor the pest. If you have, tar spot on maple, that cultural sanitation would be raking up your leaves and getting them out from under the tree every year, not mowing them in and leaving it there. Physical and mechanical, again, just make sure, they've got space, nothing's physically damaging them. Then biological control, natural pest enemy, and then last is chemical intervention. Whenever we try to get involved, if you do have to get involved chemically, you want to make as little of an impact as possible. So by keeping the trees healthy, we may be able to avoid broader spectrum pesticides that could, upset the ecosystem. So good healthy trees, picked properly, planted properly, maintained properly, get very few health problems. So we want to minimize stress, avoid monocultures, don't plant the same thing over and over again. Even if you have your favorite tree, it has friends too. It wants other trees. It wants other shrubs around. So avoid monocultures, even if it is your favorite. Discourage that pest development and avoid predisposing factors. So what those predisposing factors are to planted trees is just soil compaction, poor fertility, soil drainage, climate change, air pollution. All these things predispose a tree to health. And then if you add something on top of that, like a defoliating insect or drought, excessive salts, air pollution, this is what stresses trees out. In the end, they get a wood-boring insect or armillaria root rot, and they die. So the best way to avoid all these predisposing factors is by keeping a healthy soil. And that's going to keep, you're not going to have as many drought problems because you've got the mulch, you've got higher organic matter. It helps maintain the temperature of the soil, where a tree that's just in a lawn with grass up to the trunk has lawnmowers running over it, has a lot of nitrogen added if it's on a lawn fertilization program. These cause stress. So let the tree be where it wants to be naturally. Fake that forest environment is what you really want to do. And this is a planting that we're going to kind of follow over the years. This is what it looks like this year. And this is just the benefits of mulch on a planting. It's low material cost for the benefits. It's low labor to install it. It's fast. It adds that organic matter. It makes permanent changes. The cons, you have to talk your customer into it because they may prefer lawn. And the effects do take time if you're working on an urban soil, but we'll go over later how to kind of speed up those effects. But, a good, healthy landscape doesn't need a lot of pesticide or any other applications, just good mulch, good soil, good plants planted well. So here we have, these trees went in 2014. smaller 1.5-inch trees. That cypress was a little bigger. You can see they're not large trees, but mulched, planted at the right depth. And then the grass was removed, mulched over. So this is 2016. And you can see in 2 years, trees are growing pretty well. But this is when you really see things speed up, is the last 4 years. So 2016 to 2018, you can see that birch is now a much larger tree. It's putting on almost an inch in diameter per year. That weeping birch is doubled in size. The Hinoki cypress is much fuller. The shrubs are taking over, and you can see actually that the soil is just so much looser and more organic now. And then from 2018 to 2020, the growth was just, very exponential on these trees. They're kind of self-maintaining now. It's, unirrigated. Again, not a lot of health problems, very diverse landscape. So with patience of smaller trees and just proper installation and tree selection, with that patience of 6 years, you can go from here to here. So speeding up the benefits of mulch, what we want to do is feed the soil. So, microbes are what break down that organic matter of mulch to what the tree can use. So mycorrhizae kind of feed on that. So what we should do is, if we want to speed it up, we can add carbohydrates to the soil. That's what trees give mycorrhizae in exchange for the mycorrhizae making nutrients available to them. So if we can add carbohydrates to the soil, the tree doesn't have to rely on itself to feed them as much. And that population will just naturally explode. A lot of people add mycorrhizae in their feed solutions, but if you're not adding a carbohydrate, it doesn't really matter. There's no more food there for them. So rather than adding a mycorrhizae to your feed, add a carbohydrate like molasses. Add humic acid to increase the cation exchange capacity. Humic acid basically fakes organic matter. So if you have a soil that's doesn't have a lot of organic matter, kind of lacking in microbial activity, add that humic acid to fake that organic matter, and add those carbohydrates to really boost that microbial activity. And we can do this with just water, these liquid products. Instead of going after everything with a traditional NPK type feed, this is, BioMP, this is a molasses-based product. Again, feeds the microbes, stimulates that soil activity. Very inexpensive, but this is what really will make a difference in the long run. It's going to help break down mulch faster and organic matter, and make permanent changes over time. Again, Enviroplex is a humic acid. And what this is that faking organic matter, because we're taking trees out of the forest where there's a natural recycling of material, very healthy soils, and putting them in our front yard. So sometimes we do have to fake nature, and this is how we do it. Products like these. And then we also have Cytogrow, which is a root growth hormone. So this is cytokinins, and is basically what make trees want to grow roots. So this is going to speed up establishment. It's going to encourage that tree to use its energy towards root growth, but not cause excessive external growth. And then if you do have if you do need to put down the NPK, use a slow release like this, a 14-4-5, something a little lower that's not going to cause excessive quick growth. That can lower the immune system of trees. You want to keep that outward growth at a controlled pace to the environment. And then kind of all in one, there's a product called NutriRoot, which has the nutrients, the seaweed extract, the humic acids. It's a 2-2-3, so it's not going to cause excessive growth. It's got hygroscopic humectant, so it's a moisture control product at the same time. Really aids and assistance in plant establishment. If you're spending hundreds of dollars on this plant and your customer's spending 2 or 3 times what you've got into the tree, spending $1 or $2 on something like this to ensure that plant survival and establishment, long-term health goes a long ways. I mean, it's cheap insurance. And all these mix well together based on your soil conditions, one way or the other. Feel free to get in touch with, myself, or, on our website. We have all this information on how to make these blends to best establish plants. Here we'll just have a quick picture of, these plants, what a good established root system looks like versus a poorly established plant. So using NutriRoot with those, with the humic acid, with the seaweed extracts, with the moisture management product, what that does is it gives the tree opportunity to grow in every direction. They won't expend energy for no reason or to waste or to a sink. if they basically have to put an X amount of energy and they won't get more than that back, that's a sink. They're losing energy, not gaining. So they won't grow evenly. They'll find where water and nutrients are available, and the root system will go that way. So if you don't use products in urban soils to give a tree, nutrients and moisture availability, you'll get a one-sided root system. It's going to go to where the nutrients are, and that tree's not going to last long in the end. 10, 20 years down the road, this is where you're getting health problems, where when you use these products and establish that tree correctly, you've got a nice 360-degree healthy root system. That tree is going to be more drought tolerant, more able to sustain itself, better able to battle disease and pest on its own. And you get one shot, basically, as trees are establishing, to decide how that root zone is going to get into the ground easily. When trees are older, if they didn't establish well, it's really hard to change that. So it's important to get this done in the beginning. So again, water is the most important aspect of it. If you don't maintain the moisture after planting, a good reason trees die in the first year is lack of moisture. So plant them properly and water them properly. So hopefully in 300 or 400 years, we can have more trees like this. We need trees like this to inspire people to keep planting trees, to further our industry. We have to prove the success. You can see the roof layer on that white oak well above ground. That tree was probably planted by nature 400 years ago, but it's cared for by man now. And, now that we're planting trees, if they weren't established properly because they were left alone in nature, if we don't establish trees properly now, they won't get to this 400-year status. And that's where we really see benefits of trees. So let's talk about these benefits of trees. Financial, they save us money. They basically pay bills for us as far as electricity, natural gas, stormwater retention. We don't see all those benefits until the tree's gone. If you plant a tree properly, you can get these benefits over time. But if it's done improperly and you have to remove it, you will then incur the debt that tree was providing. It increases traffic to local business. More trees on a landscape in a business district has shown more business flow. There's more shopping done on green main streets. So it gives you that economic boost. And the greater the canopy to street ratio, the better that success is. Nice large street trees will be great for downtown. ADHD, being around trees, lowers symptoms of ADHD. It helps people calm down faster, lowers that stress. You can get very distracted. People that suffer from ADHD, it's hard to focus, especially when they're stressed. So being around trees lowers that stress and allows you to get back to being able to pay attention faster. And anybody that wants the links to these studies, feel free to reach out to me. These are just little quips I've taken from them, but they're out there. These benefits are known and documented. Asthma, growing up in an area with trees, even in an urban environment, if there's a treed neighborhood and an untreed neighborhood right next to each other, so same air pollution, there's a far less prevalence of asthma growing up near trees than when not. And that's just a studied fact. Some lower income areas don't have a lot of trees, and there's much higher prevalences of asthma there. So we need more canopy cover in the cities. 10% increase in canopy on this study was associated with a 12% decrease in crime. So it's much safer to live in areas with some trees. Some people say, yeah, there are scenarios where a criminal can hide behind a tree or something like that. But just in general, there's less crime with trees, and we'll talk about another study in a second on how that happens. There's a less prevalence of heart disease with tree canopy. Unfortunately, we were able to learn that fact because of emerald ash borer when it went through the suburbs of Chicago and killed so many trees out that way. There was a 25% increase in cardiovascular disease as those trees died. People started getting heart and lung issues when those trees were removed. Again, they're providing those benefits of cleaning toxins from the air, lowering our stress. All that combined lowers the risk of cardiovascular disease. The healing properties, just being around trees lowers our blood pressure. Seeing trees actually can reduce stress levels. This is why a lot of VAs now, when they're being built, have parks. They have park benches. They have ways to get out in nature. Not only with mental issues, mental health, physical health. stays in hospital are much shorter just having a view of a window with a tree outside. We heal faster. So we need to keep trees around, especially around hospitals and healing areas. Socializing. This is how it lowers crime. There were 50% fewer crimes in this study on tower blocks. I believe this was near Chicago. And they had a planted park next to one and just a lawn park next to the other. And with the planted park, people came outside and they had picnics and they actually met their neighbors and had their birthday parties outside. And it gave a sense of community. And that's why crime was so much lower. When you know your neighbors, you're a lot more apt to look out for each other. You're a lot more apt to have your, citizen crime watches, where if you don't know anybody, you don't know habits, you don't know how to report crimes, you don't really know what's going on. So trees make us socialize. They get us outside more, and that's a good thing. They lower stress. It lowers the cortisol, which is a stress hormone in the human body. It's also the hormone that makes us a little more prone to gaining weight. So anything we can do to lower that stress hormone is a good thing. Cooling factor. Again, this is very important in cities, especially in Europe, where air conditioning is not as common as in the United States. Good canopy cover can lower the temperature in a city by as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. But you've got to have that canopy cover exceeding 40% to really get the benefits of that. But that, makes a huge difference, especially going forward with more heat waves, more extreme weather. Making sure we have green spaces is extremely important. And they lower the temperature not only by shading pavement, those black impervious surfaces that just absorb the heat, but actually the transpiration of leaves, just like when we sweat to cool down, basically that transpiration of trees taking water out of the soil and evaporating cools. So their transpiration cools as well as the shade that's blocking the heat from building up on the pavement. Stormwater retention, just a regular street tree with a 33-foot crown, which is your average mature tree, can retain as much as 333 gallons of water in one event. So that can reduce storm runoff on impervious surfaces such as parking lots by over 20%. This keeps erosion under control. It keeps stormwater pollutants out of our lakes and rivers. And it keeps the expenses down in your town for the sewer treatment plants and things like that. So, with those top 10 reasons, other than the fact that they can sequester carbon, the mental, the physical, the economic benefits of trees is impressive. And by size, those benefits are more impressive. So pick the right tree for the right place, plant it properly, help it establish. And thank you for listening to my talk.